Before we get to the story, I'd like to say thanks so much for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading cosmic horror related stories every single day. So if that sounds good, please drop a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a lot, especially when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. Pre-demolition assessment work has a specific rhythm that I've come to rely on over 8 years of doing it. You arrive at a building that nobody has been inside for a while. You work through a checklist. You document what you find, and you leave with a report that tells the demolition crew what they're dealing with before they start swinging. Asbestos, structural compromise, hazardous material storage, water damage, pest intrusion. The categories are established and the process is straightforward, and the buildings are always empty in the way that empty buildings are supposed to be empty, which is completely. The Callard facility was not empty. It had been sealed for 12 years and nobody had been inside it, and something had been in there the whole time, growing through the walls in the dark. And when I arrived on a grey Monday morning with my clipboard and my equipment cases, I had no idea. I found out over 3 days. I wish it had taken longer. I think if it had taken longer, I would have been out of the building before I understood what I was actually looking at. And understanding, it was the part that made it hard to sleep afterward. My name is Dani, and I run building systems inspection and pre-demolition assessment on contract. Mostly commercial and industrial properties, occasionally government facilities. I work alone most of the time, and I prefer it that way. A second person on a job like this tends to slow the work down, and the work is already slow enough. The Callard facility was a pharmaceutical research building, mid-sized, 3 floors above ground and a basement level, built in the early 90s on the edge of an industrial zone about 30 miles outside the city. The company that had owned it had dissolved 12 years ago following some kind of regulatory issue that the documents I'd been given described only vaguely. The building had been sealed at that time, secured and handed over to a property holding group that had been sitting on it while a demolition permit worked its way through the approvals process. The permit had finally come through, and I had been hired to complete the pre-demo assessment before the crew moved in. Standard job. I'd done dozens like it. I arrived early on a Monday, got the key code from the site contact, and let myself in through the main entrance. The first thing I noticed was the temperature. An unheated building in winter, sealed for 12 years, should be cold inside. Not dramatically cold. Buildings retain some thermal mass, but noticeably cool. The kind of air that's been sitting undisturbed for a long time. The Callard facility was not cold. It was warmer than outside, which was in the low 40s that morning, and the air inside felt different from sealed building air, which is usually flat and stale and slightly chemical. This air had a quality I noticed before I consciously identified it. Density, maybe. Something faintly biological, not a bad smell, not rot or mold in any obvious sense, just the quality of air in a space where something living has been breathing. I didn't have a framework for that at the time, so I filed it as a ventilation anomaly, noted the temperature differential in my log, and started my assessment from the ground floor. The building's condition was consistent with 12 years of vacancy, dust on every surface, fluorescent fixtures gone dark, the particular stillness of a large space that hasn't had a person in it for a long time. I worked through the ground floor systematically, checking wall surfaces, testing floors for structural integrity, documenting the locations of any obvious water damage or material deterioration. It took most of the morning, and nothing I found was outside the expected range for a building of this age and vacancy period. I opened the first crawlspace access panel just before noon. The crawlspace ran below the ground floor piping, a standard access channel about 3 feet high that allowed maintenance access to the building's water and heating infrastructure. I put on my headlamp and went in with my camera and started working along the pipe runs from the access point. The material was about 20 feet in, threading along the outside of a cold water pipe. I stopped and looked at it and took a photograph and then looked at it again. It was pale, off-white with a slight grey tone, and it ran along the pipe in a continuous growth. Not a patch, not a cluster, a continuous and unbroken thread that followed the pipe in both directions as far as my headlamp reached. The surface of it had a texture I found hard to compare to anything. Not quite fibrous, not quite smooth, something in between. It was attached to the pipe surface directly, not hanging from it, growing against it in a way that suggested it had been using the pipe as a guide, following the infrastructure. My first thought was an unusual mold variant, or a fungal growth that had come in through a foundation crack and found the pipe environment hospitable. That happens. Not commonly, but it happens. And it was the explanation that fit the most categories. I photographed it extensively and kept moving along the crawl space. The material was present the entire length of the pipe run. When the pipes branched, the material branched with them, following each line, maintaining the same consistent thread along every surface. It covered the full crawlspace network under the ground floor without a single gap I could find. I came out and went to the first floor crawlspace. Same thing. Same material, same appearance, same behavior of following the pipe infrastructure exactly. I noted it as a biological intrusion of undetermined origin and moved on. The structural engineer, Voss, arrived the following morning. He'd been brought in by the holding company independently to assess the load-bearing elements before demolition, standard practice for a building with a basement level, and we'd coordinated to overlap our site time for 2 days. He was a compact and precise man in his 60s who had been doing this work longer than I had, and who looked at buildings with the specific attention of someone who thinks about what holds them up. I showed him the crawlspace material first thing. He went in with me to the ground floor access, and we worked along the pipe run together, and he didn't say anything for a long time. Just looked at it and occasionally touched it lightly with one gloved finger, testing its surface, checking how firmly it adhered to the pipes. When we came out, he said he didn't know what it was. He said the adhesion to the metalwork was significant, that it wasn't simply growing alongside the pipes, but had bonded with the surface in a way that would require real force to separate. He said it looked like the metal was providing structural support for the growth, that the pipes were functioning as a kind of scaffolding. He used that word specifically. Scaffolding. I've thought about it since. He said he'd never seen anything like it in a building, and that we should contact someone with a biology background before proceeding. I agreed and made a note to reach out to a contact at an environmental assessment firm when I was back in cell range that evening. We split up to cover more ground, and I took the upper floors while Voss worked through the basement stairwell access. I found the records room on the second floor, a small office that had been used for facility documentation, filing cabinets still in place and still holding folders. I wasn't required to review the records as part of my assessment, but the folder labeled Closure Documentation was sitting at the front of the first cabinet I opened, and I pulled it out and flipped through it while I was in the room. The closure report was thorough and mostly bureaucratic, the procedural language of a regulated facility being properly shut down, equipment disposal, staff departure records, utility disconnections, containment verification for each lab space. The last section was an incident addendum, dated 2 weeks before the official closure date, describing a containment anomaly in the basement laboratory. A storage unit had developed a seal failure, and its contents, described in the report only as biological research material, Category 3, had been compromised. The addendum noted that full decontamination of the affected area was not possible within the closure timeline, and that the decision had been made to seal the area behind a secondary partition wall, pending a future remediation visit. The remediation visit, as far as I could find in the remaining documentation, had never been scheduled. I put the folder back and went to find Voss. He was at the basement stairwell access, but he hadn't gone down yet. He was standing at the top of the stairs, looking down, and when I came up behind him, he turned and said he thought I should see something before we went further. He'd been tapping the wall of the stairwell with his knuckle, a habit of structural engineers, listening for the sound that tells you about the material behind the surface. He'd found a section about halfway down where the sound was wrong. Not hollow, he said, occupied. He meant there was something behind the wall that wasn't air. I told him about the closure report, the containment anomaly, the secondary partition, the remediation that never happened. He looked at me for a moment and then looked back down the stairs. We went down. The basement level was darker than the floors above. No window wells, the only light from our headlamps. The material was here too, heavier than on the floors above. The pipe runs in the basement almost entirely covered, the threads of it sometimes multiple layers thick, where pipes ran close together or crossed. The temperature was noticeably warmer down here, enough that I unzipped my jacket. Voss found the secondary partition wall about halfway along the main basement corridor. It was a different material from the original walls, newer construction, drywall over a light metal frame, hastily done. The kind of wall you put up quickly to close off a space rather than to last. 12 years old and showing it. The lower section had been breached. Not dramatically, not a large opening, a slow deformation of the wall surface from the inside. The drywall pushed outward and cracked along a line about 3 feet wide and 2 feet high near the floor. The breach was old, the edges of it dry and settled, something that had happened over years, rather than suddenly. The material was coming through it, a thick accumulation threading through the crack and spreading out along the corridor floor and up into the wall infrastructure on either side. More concentrated here than anywhere else I'd seen in the building. The threads dense enough that the floor surface around the breach was substantially covered. Voss crouched down, and I watched him tap the wall to the left of the breach. He tapped, paused, tapped again. Then he stood up and tapped the pipe running along the ceiling above us. The material on the pipe contracted, just slightly, just a few millimeters, but visibly, a small and immediate withdrawal from the point he'd struck. He tapped again. Same response. We both stood there for a moment. It reacted, I said. Yes, he said. That's real time. Yes, he said again. I went through the breach. I want to be clear that Voss did not come with me, and I don't hold that against him. He stood at the opening and held his headlamp so the beam went through ahead of me, and he said he'd stay where he was and I should not be long. The original basement lab on the other side of the partition was not recognizable as the room it had been. I know from the building plans that it had been a standard research laboratory, benches and equipment, and a regulated environment. What I moved through when I went in was something else. The material covered every surface, floor, ceiling, walls, whatever equipment remained. All of it threaded over and through and between. The pipe runs in and here were invisible beneath the accumulation. The room had a warmth that was several degrees above even the rest of the basement, and I could feel it through my jacket like standing near something with a temperature of its own. The room had been restructured, not demolished, not collapsed, changed. The material had built things with what was in the room, had used the remnants of the lab infrastructure the same way it had used the pipes upstairs, as scaffolding, as a framework to grow along and through. The bench surfaces had been incorporated. The storage units that remained had been covered and connected, threads running between them, linking them into a continuous structure. I stood in the middle of it and turned slowly with my headlamp and tried to understand the scale of what I was looking at. 12 years of growth, starting from a compromised storage unit, working outward through every available cavity in the building, threading itself through 3 floors and a basement along the infrastructure, using the building's own skeleton as a guide. It had made the building into something else. It had been doing it in the dark for 12 years, and I was the first person to come in and see what it had become. I got out. Voss was already moving toward the stairs when I came through the breach. He didn't say much, just asked if I was all right, and I said yes, and we went up and out through the main entrance and stood in the cold air of the parking lot. He said he was done. He said it clearly and without apology. He said he would file his structural report from the data he'd collected before going to the basement, and he would note the anomaly as a biological intrusion requiring specialist assessment, and he would recommend the building be handled by someone with the appropriate training and equipment before demolition proceeded. He asked if I was coming out. I told him I had one more floor to document. He looked at me the way people look at someone who's about to do something inadvisable, and then he nodded and got in his truck and drove out of the lot. I watched him go and then stood there for a few minutes in the cold and thought about what I'd seen in that basement room and whether I actually needed more documentation. I went back inside and finished the 3rd floor. The material was there, consistent as everywhere else, threaded through the pipes, responding to the taps I made against the walls with that same small contraction. I worked fast and I worked well, and I got what I needed, and I got out before noon. I wrote the report that evening from my laptop in my car in a gas station parking lot 20 miles from the facility, because I wanted to be away from it before I put anything down in writing. I wrote it carefully, using language that was accurate and professional and that stayed close to what I could document: the biological intrusion, its extent through the building's infrastructure, the metabolic activity evidenced by the temperature differential and the reactive behavior, the compromised basement containment, the breach of the secondary partition. I recommended immediate demolition, full structure, and I recommended that the crew be briefed on the presence of the biological material and provided with appropriate protective equipment. I recommended that no further individual assessment be undertaken inside the building. I sent it to the holding company's project contact and to the demolition firm, and I flagged it as priority review. I got a response the following morning, acknowledging receipt. They said the demolition was approved and the crew was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks. The call came 3 days before the demolition date. The site supervisor, a man named Garrett, who I'd had one brief conversation with before the job, called me in the early evening and asked if I'd seen the exterior of the building recently. I told him I hadn't been back since completing my assessment. He said something had changed on the outer walls. He'd driven out to do a pre-demo site check that afternoon and found that the exterior surface of the building, the brick and panel cladding of the outer walls, had changed in appearance. He described threads visible on the surface, pale and consistent, running along the exterior joints and window frames, following the building's external infrastructure the same way I described the interior material following the internal pipes. It had reached the outside. I asked him how extensive it was. He said it was on all 4 sides. I asked if demolition was still on schedule. There was a pause, the kind that tells you the answer before the words come. He said they were waiting on a second opinion from a specialist contractor. He said the demolition firm's crew lead had looked at the exterior and had some questions he wanted answered before he put his people on site. I understood that. I didn't argue with it. I asked Garrett if anyone had been inside. Since my assessment, he said no. The building had stayed locked. I asked how fast he thought it had spread to the exterior, whether the coverage he was seeing was recent, or whether it might have been developing for some time and just not noticed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he drove past that building once a week on his regular site route, and he was confident the exterior had been clear as recently as 10 days ago. I sat with that for a moment. The material had been in the building for 12 years, contained within the internal structure. In the 10 days since I had walked through that basement, gone through that breach, moved through that room and its warmth and its accumulated 12 years of growth, it had reached the outside. I thought about Voss tapping the pipe, the contraction, real-time response. I thought about the temperature differential, the metabolic heat of something living in every wall of a 3-story building. I told Garrett to make sure nobody went inside while they were waiting on the second opinion. He said, of course, that was standard protocol. I told him to make sure. Not just standard protocol. Make sure. He said he understood. I don't know if demolition has happened yet. I filed my report and made my recommendation, and I did what I was contracted to do. Whatever happens next is in someone else's hands. What I keep thinking about is the closure report, the containment anomaly, the compromised storage unit, the Category 3 biological research material that a company in some kind of regulatory trouble had sealed behind a temporary wall instead of properly handling, with a remediation visit They never scheduled, and apparently never intended to schedule. Whatever was in that storage unit had 12 years in a sealed building to become what I found. It started in one room in a basement, and it had the whole building by the time I arrived. Every wall, every pipe, every conduit, every available space in the structure threaded through with something alive and warm and responding. I don't know what it was before. I don't know what it is now. I know it's on the outside of the walls, and I know it got there in 10 days, and I know there's a lot more outside than there is inside. I'm waiting to hear that demolition went ahead. I've been waiting for a week.